Thank you for joining Darien Library this Monday afternoon for a commemoration of the 70th anniversary of the Korean War, Week 4, The Aftermath. We're joined today by Mark Albertson. He's a historical research editor at Army Aviation magazine and is a longtime member of the United States Naval Institute. In addition, Mark teaches history at Norwalk Community College, and we are lucky to share this next hour with him. Before I begin, I would like to mention that programs at Darien Library are made possible by the annual Friends of the Library campaign. We thank you for your support to make programs like this, as well as our collections, available to the community. Now, take it away, Mark.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. This is week 4 of 4 on the 70th anniversary of the Korean War, the forgotten war, as put forth by some, or as I mentioned in the first talk, this notion of it being a police action, which I know, boy, that really bristles some Korean War vets I know. But the war ends up where it started off, at the 38th parallel. And I mentioned, I believe too, when I got into the talks at the Panmunjom, where the peace discussions were taking place, that at one point, it could be a bit of comic relief here, that the Americans at this peace talk were generally taller than their communist counterparts. And after a while, I think it was the North Koreans and Red Chinese who insisted that, that the legs on the chairs be cut so that everyone looked like they were the same height. I mean, concerned as they were about the propaganda aspects of physical stature here. And so the war will wind up stopping. I mean, it stops for the moment here as a ceasefire. There's no peace treaty signed here. We don't see the Versailles Treaty anymore. We don't see what happened at the end of World War II. They're just ceasefires. And so this leaves what happened at the end of the war up in the air. And so when some of these Korean War veterans tell you that their war is the longest running war in American history, since there was no the peace treaty per se, that they're onto something here, and they kind of, some of them bristle at these political pundits or journalists who say that Afghanistan is America's longest running war. It's been on for quite a while now. Next year will make it the 20 years we've been doing this in Afghanistan. I know, Jane, it doesn't seem like it's that long, but it is. But I mean, we're talking about July 27, 1953 here with regards to the Korean ceasefire. And ever since that day, we've had the periodic incursions by the North into South Korea, whether by sea or by land. Periodically, there's been people killed along the DMZ. And so these incidents haven't really stopped over the years. Although you did have a possibility here that the United States and North Korea would get together with regards to the nuclear issue, but even that seems to be up in the air at this point. So, but what does this really mean in the context? Let's say for the United States, July 27, 1953. Well, keep in mind what I mentioned earlier here. When you look back at the United States Army, and when I put forth this example earlier, I didn't note the Civil War. Lincoln, or not Lincoln, Ulysses S. Grant, him and Sherman were going to destroy. There was only one way to end this war. They were going to destroy the Southern economy to bring the Southerners to the conference table. 1917. It was still, to tell you the truth here, emblematic of the United States Army doctrine that you destroy the enemy's army or pursue it until it's destroyed to bring them to the conference table. 1939, 1941, this doctrine still holds. You're going to destroy the enemy army to bring them to the conference table. That was still the American doctrine in 1950. And so when the UN kicked or evicted the North Koreans from South Korea, especially after the invasion of Incheon on September 14, 1950, General Douglas MacArthur, whose intent was on invading North Korea, knocking out the Pyongyang regime, and even getting involved here. There was talk of even getting involved nationalist China to reverse the revolution in mainland China. And George Kennan was one of those who told Truman, don't listen to MacArthur, don't listen to the Joint Chiefs, don't listen to Paul Nietzsche. You've kicked the North Koreans out of South Korea. The doctrine of containment to eliminate the chance of a long war is, or a real dangerous war, you stop. You kick them out of the South Korea, so stop at the 38th parallel, and Truman will go along with what's been asked of him earlier, and they will invade North Korea. Of course, this brings into the war communist China, Red China. And on the night of November 25, 26, 1953, you see, 1950, 300,000 Chinese, and they were billed as volunteers. And so a war that could have been short was now going to be transformed into a protracted conflict. And when the army settled down along the 38th parallel, spring of 1951, this war will go on for 2 more years as a stalemate, a la what happened on the Western Front from 1914, 1918 in the First World War. So so American doctrine, as far as destroying an enemy army to bring them to the conference table, seemed like it was killed on the night of November 25, 26, 1950. And ever since then, Korea being an example, Vietnam being another example, Iraq being a classic example here, and it looks like Afghanistan is going to wind up the same way. Except for the Persian Gulf War, which by comparison to some of these other conflicts was a 4-day cakewalk, really. But then again, we were in concert with NATO and some of the Arab powers that were evicting Saddam from Kuwait. Then again, even though they did a lot of damage to Iraq, to Saddam's army, did Saddam survive the Persian Gulf War? Answer is yes, he stayed in power. And you can make the case here. Here's a guy who loses a war and maintains his presidency. That's what you want to call him. I call him a dictator. Yet again, George Bush Sr., who was the president of the United States and considered by some the victor of this war, is voted out of office. Interesting. Kind of shares what happened to Churchill in 1945, doesn't he? Where Churchill helped win the war. What happened to him? Out. Interesting how fickle some people can be. But the fact of the matter is here, there's something else going on here at the same time of the Korean conflict. And it was a conflict that was longer. And it started before Korea, ends after Korea. Vietnam, the North Vietnam, the French, who were looking to resurrect their empire, which is beyond the scope of reality here. I mean, revolutionary nationalism is really riding a wave here, and they have no chance really of doing this. In fact, if you really want to get down to the prospects of France's success, by 1953, the United States, the taxpayer, was in Vietnam before the soldiers were. And so here you see the US taxpayer contributing in 1953, going into 1954, $1.063 billion to the French effort in Vietnam. Now, this is part of a larger picture, the so-called spread of communism. You saw Europe divided up after 45. They had the East Bloc and the West Bloc. Czechoslovakia, after the coup of 1948, officially becomes part of that East Bloc. The Soviets blow an atomic bomb in 1949. Chiang Kai-shek loses to Ho Chi Minh, the Chinese Civil War, 1949. After a while here, the French are not doing as well in North Vietnam. And what do you think the French people are doing? They are beginning to protest like they will here 16 years later. Some of them are in the streets. And so the war in North Vietnam is not going well. And the Korean War degenerates into a stalemate. And doesn't in the early 1950s, the Soviets blow a hydrogen bomb. So it seems as if communism is on the march. There can be arguments against this, but it seems like communism is on the march. And NATO is formed, the Warsaw Pact is formed, and yet within the stalemate here, you see in 1953, well, what happened in North Vietnam? Well, the early part of North Vietnam, the Battle of Dien Bien Phu was appearing here between March, May 1954. And already they're settling in for the Geneva talks in Geneva, Switzerland, which will be the Geneva Accords. And Ho Chi Minh wants to win the Battle of Dien Bien Phu because a big battlefield victory here will give him a leg up in the talks. And sure enough, remember Dwight Eisenhower taking a look at a map of the French dispositions at Dien Bien Phu, and they were in a bowl. The North Vietnamese controlled the mountains around Dien Bien Phu, and Eisenhower's thinking, who the heck ever came up with this plan? And so you've got 15,000 French, many of them paratroopers, inside a bowl surrounded by 55,000 North Vietnamese troops, which by this time, the NVA, North Vietnamese Army, is a pretty darn good army at this point. They've moved from solely being a guerrilla outfit to a conventional army. And they're very good at what they do. And so at this point, the negotiations in Geneva, the French are really having a problem here. And with an operation known as, what the name of it? Anyway, the United States, with the French were asking the United States for help. And it was not just political help. And the first plan to be brought up by the chiefs of staff, which, by the way, Admiral Arthur Radford of the Navy supported this plan. General Nathan Twining, if you remember him, Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force, supported this plan. Matthew Ridgway did not. Ridgway, after seeing what happened in Korea, stated that if we're going to get involved in North Vietnam, you're going to need 7 divisions. If the Chinese enter the war, you're going to need 12. But since Eisenhower was already reducing the size of the United States Army here, where are the troops going to come from when you're manning that standoff in Europe against the Soviets? Where are the men going to come from? And so it was even, one of the plans here was to have 60 B-29s leave the Philippines and carpet bomb the North Vietnamese troops surrounding the French at Dien Bien Phu, escorted by 150 carrier fighters from the United States Navy. It was even brought up here in discussion about using low-level nuclear weapons on the North Vietnamese. And Eisenhower said, if we do this, we'll have to deny it for 20 years. Needless to say, this operation was canceled, and the French will go down to defeat. And so again, it seems like communism is on the move. And so at the Geneva Accords, you're going to have a peace treaty signed. Vietnam will be divided at the 17th parallel. North Vietnam to the north, South Vietnam to the south. And here, by the way, the French and the North Vietnamese, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, will sign a ceasefire. However, with the accords themselves, the United States and South Vietnam will not sign them. They were supposed to have elections to reunify Vietnam in 1956. That's not what Diem wants. Ngo Dinh Diem, if you remember him, he'll eventually be assassinated in 1953. He wanted elections so that yes, he can control South Vietnam. And so what are the communists thinking here? Well, the idea of elections to unify the country are going to be out. We may have to go back to the battlefield to unify the country, and you know that this is where this is going to go. In fact, it's in the Pentagon Papers that Eisenhower made a remark, if they're going to have national elections to unify the country, Ho Chi Minh would probably get 80% of the vote. Well, Washington knows what that means. They don't want to give up South Vietnam. How about the other side of the coin? The United States itself back home here. Eisenhower did not want us in another war like Korea. He thought too many of these kinds of conflicts is going to turn us into a garrison state. And so he's going to reduce the Army at one point from 20 divisions to 14. The Air Force will be enlarged. Why? Because again, we're not talking B-29s anymore. We're getting away from that. How about B-47s and eventually the B-52 bomber? These are jet bombers with longer ranges, able to carry nuclear weapons. They can be refueled on the way. In fact, at this point, you are seeing the formation of Strategic Air Command, SAC as it was known. And I remember as a kid going up to Plattsburgh's Air Force Base, which was a SAC base when I was a kid. And my father knew a man who was in the United States Air Force. The man put in his 25, he was in the 25, 30 years in the Air Force, and he retired as a colonel. He was an accountant. He would go to a new base every 2 or 3 years, help with the books. They pushed him on to another base. Well, at this point, he was up in Plattsburgh. And I remember he took us on a tour in his station wagon. And I remember the station wagon because a lot of people like this car today. It was a 1957 Chevrolet station wagon, if some of you car buffs remember that one. And he took us on a tour of the base. And I remember I heard this deep-throated, like, was a jet engine, turn around to the left side of the car. There's a B-52 coming down with the lights flashing, making a practice landing. And he came over the car, and wheels barely touched the ground, and he took off again. I mean, it was an awe-inspiring sight to see this big B-52. But we got our tour, and I remember learning that at the SAC base, each B-52 had 3 men. And they lived in a place called the bunker. And you had 2 crews for these B-52s. One crew was on for 2 weeks, the second crew on for another 2 weeks, and then the first crew came back. And they all lived in the bunker, and they all had to be together. And so while you're living in this thing known as the bunker, which was a big complex, and you had your own movie theater here. They had their own movie theater. If 2 of the 3 wanted to go to the movie theater, the third had to go, whether he liked the movie or not. Why? They all had to be together. They all had to be together here. And so interesting how they set this up. And this is called massive retaliation. It was part of the new looking back defense. And the idea of mass retaliation was that if the United States was threatened strategically, the bomber force of the United States Air Force would launch these bombers and nuclearize a city, perhaps, or an area where there's a lot of industrialization. This was called massive retaliation. Of course, the Army here is being left out of the nuclear largesse. Well, they can't deliver nuclear weapons internationally. That's not what they're in business for. And yet there are some who are saying again, well, maybe we don't need ground forces or need quite as many of them. And so this is where the Army begins to do a few things. I'm sure some of you fellows who were in the Army during the 1950s perhaps remember the atomic cannon, that 280 millimeter artillery piece, which could fire a battlefield nuclear round some 20 miles out. The helicopter was being used, I mentioned this earlier, for moving troops on a nuclear battlefield. They are trying to find something for these guys to do here to maintain the Army. That's part of this, is to maintain the Army budget. The Navy too is moving to really large aircraft carriers. During World War II, when you had the Essex class aircraft carriers, which are just over 20,000 tons, 23,000 tons, the planes were like 7,000, 8,000, maybe 10,000 pounds. Now the Navy wants planes that are 30,000 pounds, 40,000 pounds, planes that can carry nuclear armament. Well, you can't do that with a 22,000 ton aircraft carrier. You need an aircraft carrier that's 50, 60, 70,000 tons. So the ships are getting bigger. The Navy wants part of that budget, but it's the Air Force that has the inside track here. And so at this point, but at this point too, post-Korea, you think the Soviets are just sitting back? They're beginning to get into missile technology as well. And so the United States is beginning to build intercontinental ballistic missiles. You are seeing now, you will see soon, nuclear missiles on submarines. So the whole thing is evolving here, all from the perspective that no longer will the United States be able to defeat an enemy army on the ground and bring them to the conference table. You are now getting involved in this nuclear standoff. This is where the Cold War is going here. And so it's fascinating to see how with post-Korea, the United States lost its edge, especially the ground forces lost its edge here on determining the fight on the battlefield. This is something that needs to be really understood. In fact, again, I mentioned this in previous talks, but it needs to be mentioned now. Roger Trinchie, a French soldier who fought not only in World War II, but this was a guy who fought in North Vietnam against the Viet Minh. And then to add insult to injury, he was sent to Algeria and fought there as well. And he wrote a study that many people, and I've got this study, and it's a tremendous, if you're interested in military affairs, it's really a tremendous study to read. How he refutes the notion that after 1945, people are still enamored with soldiers in their uniforms, like an American soldier, Russian, British, so on and so forth. No, he said the new uniform was going to be street clothes, the guerrilla and the terrorist. You don't think he hasn't been right? Interesting, the study came out in 1962. He's been right. Why? He fought against this after 45. And so he also intimates how the atomic bomb changes things, and it does. Nobody wants a war like World War II anymore. How are you going to fight it? How are you going to fight it before the nuclear option comes into play here? And so it's interesting how Korea was really that first war fought in the nuclear era, but without nuclear weapons. Of course, let's understand something too at this point. Nuclear weaponry wasn't as developed as it will be by the time of Vietnam. I have to give you that. However, having said that, the Persian Gulf War was fought in a nuclear era, as are these two wars, but again, we're not involved with the Russians. And so Vietnam really here is that epitome of a war fought in a conventional manner, but in that nuclear era, between the standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union. Of course, let's understand something too. The North Vietnamese were proxies for Moscow anyway, to a certain extent. But what happened after Korea here is just astounding what happened, because we didn't win the war. Vietnam is another political defeat. Again, the Persian Gulf War, it's only a 4-day war. At Iraq, political defeat. And Afghanistan, you think you're going to win here? I don't think so. And what happened to Korea? Korea eventually develops into two functioning states. It has yet to be unified, but it's two functioning states. North Korea is even more militarized now than it was prior to June 25, 1950. And that's another aspect of Korea. Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un. This has been billed as a communist state. If you've read the Communist Manifesto, I never saw any references to nepotism by Karl Marx. That's what you got here. I guess, they took communism, if they want to call it that, and they've gone their own way with it. Right now, instead of 190,000 men in that Korean army, there's upwards of 1 million. And now the country's in developing nuclear weapons. South Korea, still a US ally, but South Korea, as little as it is, has gotten to be an important economic power, especially technologically. That's big. That's huge. And so it's interesting where Korea has gone since 1953 and rebuilt itself, especially South Korea has rebuilt itself and joined those industrialized nations, large or small, to be a factor here on the globe scene, on the world scene. Even Taiwan has a little economic muscle here with regards to technology. This is where you're going. You're no longer in the Industrial Revolution. You've been in the technology revolution. You don't have to be a big power for that. Even Finland has what? One of the two cell phone companies, one of the big cell phone companies in the world, Nokia. And so when you see countries like this and South Korea is no different. They can compete on the world scene economically. Why? Because of technology. So it's fascinating to see where we've gone since 1945, 1950, 1953, and beyond. But of course, the remnants of the Korean War one of the big remnants of the Korean War is we still have 30,000 men on that 38th parallel. That hasn't changed. And that's been that way, since the ceasefire on July 27, 1953. And so is Korea still a hot flashpoint? Yes. How about China in this? China in 1950 is not the China of 2020. China was still that backward peasant economy, that backward peasant country, still run by the peasants' revolutionary Mao Zedong. And of course, he did not want an American lackey government setting itself up on the Yalu River or the Chinese border. So they'll send those troops in. Today, and let's understand something too, despite Blum and bluster, keep in mind, China lost upwards of 1 million men in this war in Korea. Recall what I said earlier, that the stalemate on the 38th parallel, the trench line, it was a constant struggle against Western technology, against communist manpower. And in the course of this conflict, when the communists, in fact, we didn't even add the North Korean dead, but the Chinese, upwards of 1 million men. That's a lot of men in 3 years. That's a lot of men in 3 years. But they didn't have the technology. Where has China gone as of then? Where is it gone now? Isn't it the world's second largest economy right now? Haven't they really embarked on a technological road here, industrialized road, the Belt and Road Initiative here? The last thing they want is a war in Korea. They don't want one either. They don't want one either. And so interesting here that their client state, North Korea, is engaged in nuclear weaponry, which makes you wonder just how much China really controls Kim Jong-un. Although I'm sure they have some sort of say here because they hold some of the economic strings for North Korea. But China too does not want another war. They are looking to become more respectable. That's what they're looking to be. It's like I always remember, and I bring them up occasionally. Jake Greasy Thumbs Guzik, Capone's bookkeeper, when he was trying to explain that when Roosevelt becomes president, they're going to revoke the Volstead Act and booze will become legal. And so, what do we need to do to make sure we still generate money? How about junk? How about drugs? And you don't need And you don't need beer breweries and trucks and pipes and have that smell. All you need is a few packages in a closet and you can make yourself millions of dollars. That's how the Chinese are seeing this. Why do we want another war for? We got the Belt and Road Initiative. That holds primacy, not a situation in Korea. And so here you see China has evolved as well in this situation here. At this point, we've been into this now maybe about 33 minutes. I think now is a point here, since we are at this stage, to have to open it up a little bit. If anyone has any questions or observations as to the Korean War itself, the result, or any one of these particular powers and interest. Even if you want to ask about Vietnam, you can do that too, because that's part of this aftermath here. Right. Well, yeah, you got to keep them deaf, dumb, and stupid. And so, but then again, one has to consider the fact that eventually, that if the people are going to be freezing in the winter, some of them are food challenged. You don't think eventually there's going to be some kind of backlash coming here eventually? I mean, no power lasts forever. Of course, that doesn't take into account how many people are going to die because of this. That's not the point.
But it only takes one. It only takes
it only takes one, right?
One person.
But then again, when you look at, well, but then again, when you take a look at Kim Jong-un, Keith, hasn't he? We'll use the term disciplined members of his own family to stay in power.
Yeah, big shotguns.
Yeah, almost like the crown, almost like the Saudi king's son now.
Oh, please.
Yeah, talk about nepotism, right? And so, yeah, I mean, there is such a stark difference between how the people in South Korea live as opposed to how the people in North Korea live.
Yeah,
I mean, it's day and night. It's day and night. So where is this going to go? At this point, I don't know. Although it seems like their president and our president have fallen out of love. Maybe, if you remember the comment a while back.
Yeah, right.
But I mean, the fact of the matter is, even though, I mean, North Korea, Kim Jong-un sells that note, and he's got a leg to stand on here, Keith, that in the end here, he's going to bring up how the United States Air Force, virtually destroyed infrastructure in North Korea and then bombed the dams to flood the country. And you don't think he doesn't bring that up, that we need nuclear weapons to protect ourselves. We need that million-man army to keep out the invaders. He's going to, in other words, he's going to stoke that fear, is what he's going to do here. And he has. And so maybe some of these people, well, we have to put up with this a while longer. Well, how long is a while longer? So it seems to work for him. That goes back to
last forever.
Right. Well, that goes back to China overseeing Vietnam, I don't know, for 1,000 years. And the Vietnamese made numerous attempts to throw them out. But I always remember what you're saying here. I always remember what Ho Chi Minh once stated at a Communist Party meeting in 1945. When the war was immediately over, it was agreed at Potsdam that the British would occupy South Vietnam and that nationalist Chinese troops would occupy North Vietnam until the French came back. And the idea was to, that once the French were able to mount that army to occupy Vietnam, then the other two powers would get out. And so it was pitched to Ho Chi Minh, who virtually had to agree to let the French back in. And he told his followers this at a Communist Party meeting. And, what, we're allowing the French back in here? And Ho Chi Minh, because the Chiang Kai-shek's army was looting North Vietnam. They had 180,000 men in North Vietnam. They were looting the place. And so Ho made sure that the Viet Minh did not start any fighting with the Chinese. He didn't want the Chinese staying there any longer than they were supposed to be there. let's get them out of here. We'll take what we have to take. But he admitted it, but he agreed to having the French brought back. And he got shouted down for this. And he said, you folks forgot your history. Again, here we go again with history. You folks forgot your history. And he said, this is what he said, I would rather sniff French crap for 25 years than eat Chinese crap for another 1,000. All of a sudden the light bulbs come on, you know? And sure enough, as the French began to come back to Vietnam, the Chinese evacuated. But it's that historical stigma of China occupying Vietnam or trying to make it part of China that's really it's handed down generation to generation here. So yeah, some of these Vietnamese have a leg to stand on here when they make references such as this. And then you go back to the Vietnam War. The Soviets, they were somewhat of a Soviet client, but they didn't want to be a client of Peking. So it's fascinating here. Even though they were both communist, that only goes so far. There's still that something called nationalism, which is something even Marx couldn't overcome. Workers of the world unite. Well, yeah, some of these countries call themselves communist, but boy, their nationalism comes right up to the fore here. Interesting. Yeah, no, they know capitalism.
You seem to.
That's like China. Is China really a communist state? Doesn't seem to be. They've been able to, they maintain the same first letter, a C, but they went from what, communism to capitalism?
Yeah,
even Stalin here, with his state capitalist approach to build that Soviet industrial monolith. Well, isn't this what the Chinese did? Well, though, Keith, the big thing for Ho Chi Minh and the so-called communists, and they were revolutionary. Ho even admitted he was more of a revolutionary nationalist than a communist.
Right.
But the fact of the matter is, they were going to unite this country no matter what. But then again, they united it, and they had an authoritarian type regime. But what happened to that regime over time? They invited the Americans back in, didn't they? Like you say.
Sure.
And so what's happened here? They've adopted capitalism too. They've adopted this as well. Now, this isn't to say that it's going to be the American Declaration. This isn't going to say it's the emblematic of the United States Constitution. That's not the point. The point here is, even Cuba, all right, people can say all they want about Fidel Castro here. He's a thug. He's a dictator, especially if you're one of those Cuban emigres who went to Florida and didn't like him. And I understand why. But the fact of the matter is, you can complain about Castro all you want. He gave that country something the United States never would have given it. And he gave that country something Spain never would have given it. It's called independence. What the Cubans do with it should be their business.
Right.
Isn't that what Ho and them, and Ho doesn't see it. He dies before it's over. But then again, isn't that what Hanoi gave the entire country here? Independence. Yeah.
They create their own destiny.
Right. Now, going back to what you were saying before about China, China coming in there, and China has invested heavily in Vietnam. So does that set well with some Vietnamese? No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. Did the Japanese investing in Rockefeller Center go over well here in certain quarters? Not really.
And yet China invests.
And so, when the war is over with, a country like Vietnam needed to be rebuilt. Yeah. And they weren't going to be able to do that solely on their own. I mean, after the pummeling that took. So yeah, after a while, you're quite right about what you said earlier about Americans holding a grudge. The problem here is, Keith, this country never totally recovered from Vietnam. Never did. That war was a reality check. You're not invincible. In the end, you're not going to run the world. Guess what? You can be humbled too. And that's exactly what happened here.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was. It's fascinating. Well, you got the civil rights movement going on at the same time.
Right. Right.
You know, and people and young people in colleges questioning America's state religion, capitalism. You know, that's going on. So yeah, Vietnam was a reality check for this country. It truly was. And frankly, I don't think we ever quite got over it. Despite the fact what George Bush Sr. said after the Persian Gulf War, well, we threw out the Vietnam syndrome. Well, no, not really. Not really. So that I find fascinating. It's one of those episodes that's helping to undermine the country at this point. Yeah, I think, number one, I think what you're seeing here, and this has been going on for a while, you know, I think it's only a matter of time, Gary, before we no longer have a foothold in Okinawa. You know, all those Okinawans don't want us there. And so they have been dredging or deepening the harbor here in Guam. And Guam can be positioned to be that Navy or Marine base that you need for a rapid reply force. But at the same time, yeah, especially now with China coming on as a determining power, you know, economically, politically, and they are building their military. Although it seems that they're doing what we did at the end of the 19th into the 20th centuries. They're relying on their economic and financial muscle. But that doesn't mean they're not building a military here. They are. And so what is that going to mean in the future here? I mean, Japan, Gary, how about Japan? There's discussions there about getting, they're on their way to getting their first aircraft carrier here since World War II. Now, in the Japanese Constitution, it states they can't devote more than 1% of their gross national product to defense. Well, are the Japanese beginning to think that maybe, just maybe, the United States cannot be counted on in the next 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20? Well, what does that mean? Does that mean they're going to have to get back into this thing about building a navy like the Imperial Navy? Is that where they're going to go here? And I remember reading a quote by Putin, oh God, about 5 years ago, when they were talking about Japan coming back militarily. And I guess he made reference to the fact, well, if that's going to happen, and as China modernizes, we are going to, meaning Russia, we are going to have to review our strategic policies here as well. What does that mean? So where are we going? And this is interesting too, Gary, from the perspective, where's economic power going at this point? It's going to Asia, isn't it? Of course it is. So, you know, it seems that what? Military power is going to follow economic power. I mean, go back to what Hitler once said. War is economics. Of course, he was a lousy economist anyway. But I mean, the fact of the matter is that basic statement is quite correct, isn't it? War is economics. Sure it is. Correct. In fact, when you go back to, in fact, I'm doing a study on this now for that. When I was with your group the other day, on that talk I gave there, mentioned the book I'm writing for Army Aviation magazine. I'm well into volume 2 at this point. In fact, the chapter I'm writing on Afghanistan, I came up with an idea. Why should I just write about our use of the helicopter in Afghanistan? How about the Russians? So I'm doing the Russians now. And going back to what you just stated about the Belt and Road Initiative being, yeah, arteries for military use as well. In the early 1950s, you know, Afghanistan doesn't have a vast infrastructure for transportation. And so the Russians built some roads in Afghanistan in the early 50s, Gary. And guess what? Guess what roads they're going to use when they invaded Afghanistan in 1979? The roads they built. And so, yeah, you're quite right here. You're quite right. Well, look at the Autobahns in Germany when Hitler built the Autobahns to move, for people to, the cars, the highways, so on and so forth.
They're
Well, what
also
other
automated.
use was there for the Autobahns?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, especially east and west. Go from the French border to the Polish border here. Yeah, interesting, interesting. Yeah, you're not moving an XM1 tank underneath one of those bridges on the Merritt Parkway. Yeah, that's kind of a slight. It's a it's a developing country, but it's pretty well advanced for a developing country. It's the world's second ranking economic power. It's developing country. It depends on how you look at that terminology, developing country. We're not talking about the Congo here. We're talking about China. Well, again, Gary, that's something like, well, I don't see that's any really too much different than what George Kennan said back in 1948 about this country. After 1945, we went from being a global power to a superpower. And George Kennan, who was one of the co-authors of the Marshall Plan, stated, and I've got this in my records here, that that 1948 he wrote this, that America has 6.3% of the world's population, yet controls 50% of the world's resources. We can not only be but the butt of envy and resentment. And so the time has come where we ought to stop these childish notions of spreading democratization, raising other people's living standards. In other words, you're a big power, act like one. That's George Kennan, the man who was a co-author of the Marshall Plan. And one of the reasons for that was you got these millions of men coming out of a uniform after 1945. You darn well better have a job for them, or else you trained them to kill. So why did they rebuild Western Europe and Japan as dumping grounds for American goods? Help build the middle class in this country. Worked with the GI Bill to help build the middle class in this country. I mean, there's nothing inherently wrong with this, as long as you understand this is the reason we're doing this in the first place. We're not doing this because we are doing it out of the goodness of our heart. I don't believe that stuff. This gets back to your founders, Gary, again. If men were angels, they wouldn't need a government. And the Chinese are doing the same sort of thing. Although now they're a competitor, and some people here don't like it. So, and I'm sure Mr. Trump's daughter doesn't care. She's making millions of dollars out of China anyway. Well, again here, the Chinese are still on the uptick, and they think their system, they have a reason to think their system is working and ours is not. They've recovered a lot from COVID-19. In fact, what is it? In the third quarter, the second or third quarter, their economy went up 4.1%. They take a look at us as floundering. And so if they're looking at us and they think we're floundering, what do you think some of the Europeans are doing? You didn't take COVID-19 seriously enough. Yeah, it is a disease and people die. And so where's the American economy going? And so, yeah, we're not looked upon, we're looked upon as a joke in many countries now. And that rationale is not far off the mark. We look disorganized, we sound disorganized. You can tell that from the pronouncements coming out of Washington. And here again too, you have a country right now where since the middle of March up till now, the restricted clique at the top has made $931 billion, while the bottom 44% of the American population is making $18,000 to $20,000 a year. How long do you think that's going to last? So the Chinese are looking at it. Yeah, our system works pretty good. And I've been trying to trace more of what they're doing in Turkey, which is fascinating. Since 2006, middle of 2016. They've invested upwards of 7.5 billion in Turkey. Yeah. And so if they can use Turkey as a jump off point, maybe they can get more deeply involved in what's going on in Greece, Italy, the Iberian Peninsula, you know, Southern Europeans, who the Northern Europeans look upon as, you know, the people who aren't doing as well, you know, or the inferior types. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting to see what China is. It's fascinating. But then again, they don't want another war in Korea. You know, 1950 was one thing. This is 2020. Maybe the Chinese have learned their lesson here. You know, but then again, we can make the argument too that perhaps, even though they are no longer that backward peasant economy and society that Mao had to try to fix, maybe they had to go through that stage with Mao Zedong to get to where they are now. I mean,
When you have a,
didn't we start off as an agrarian country?
yes.
Look what happened to us. Yeah, you know, that was, you know, Lenin remarked that Lenin was a Marxist, and so he believed in that proletarian revolution. But then again, you know, when he's making these pronouncements, the very early part of the 20th century, Russia is 90% peasant. Then
Right.
he makes the remark too, though, that if the proletarian revolution is going to succeed in Russia, it needs to be affiliated with the peasantry. Only unlike Maximilian Robespierre, who tried that and lost, Lenin will try that and succeed. He wasn't stupid. But then again, he had to give the land to the peasants. Otherwise, it's no deal. It's that simple. It's that simple. And yet he wanted to nationalize. He was able to nationalize the banks. He nationalized large corporations. Although keep in mind, Lenin let people with small businesses run their own businesses. He didn't nationalize them, but he did nationalize big corporations and big banks. He wanted to nationalize the land, but he knew he couldn't. Well, who is going to put the people back on the collectives? Stalin will. And you know how he's going to do that. You took my classes. You know how he's going to do that. That's it. But then he industrialized Russia. Well, what happened in China? You know, the peasant revolution. Well, look at China now. Are they going through a peasant revolution? No, but maybe they had to go through that peasant revolution to get to where they are now. You know, events proceed on a certain course. And they've proceeded in China from the late 1920s, you know, Mao's notion of the peasant revolution, because we don't have any industry here to speak of. We don't have industrialized workers. Where are we coming off with this proletariat revolution stuff? No, Mao's version of communism was the peasant revolution. And that will be Ho Chi Minh's too. Basically, that's going to be Castro, you know. And so it's fascinating here how these people grab a doctrine and mold it to their own environment and then go with it. America was founded on owning land. Now look at it. It's an industrialized, it became an industrialized power, financial power. Well, an interesting point you make here, you know, when you go back to Europe and feudalism, which one of the reasons our revolution succeeded the way it did, because we skipped that stage. You didn't have feudalism or serfdom here. We skipped that stage. Right. And so some of the first people that came here already had land right from the get-go. Okay, so we eliminate the feudalism serfdom. However, if you chart this, Sandy, you can chart this. You see the elimination of feudalism, you know, and serfdom in the West first, and it slowly moves east. Okay, and so, of course, in 1861, the Russians abolished serfdom, feudalism. Well, okay, gee, the peasant can buy the land. Yeah, with a 50-year mortgage?
Right. That was the problem.
Because the boyars, the landed gentry had to be kept in the game. They have to make money. But then again, this movement is still moving east. In fact, even Ho Chi Minh here at Paris, you know, Versailles Treaty, hoping to Wilson's 14 points. You know, no, your area is going to stay with the French, the colonial system. Well, what the heck? So he becomes he's one of the founders of the French Communist Party, for Pete's sakes. But
Right.
he's going to look at it too from that perspective of the peasant, just like Mao will. But the idea of converting these economies is slow over the centuries, moving east. Now look what you got. Well, the funny part about that is, when you go back to when Mao took power in China, he offered China as a model for Africa. Now what do you got? You got 1 million Chinese living in Africa. I don't think they're pitching that agrarian communism anymore.
No.
So again, they've altered the agenda. We're all products of our environment. Despite the fact we help make our environment, we're still products of our environment. So we're not going to be extolling Mao's little red book here anymore. We're going to be extolling what? Adam Smith? Yeah, it's interesting here. We have followed the basic definition of a corporate fascist state as denoted by Mussolini for years now. Big businesses, big corporations run your economy. That's the basic definition of a corporate fascist state. So we've been fascist years before Trump.
He's looking.
Domino effect, right?
Yes.
Yeah, that was there is historical track record for the domino effect. Churchill brought that up towards the end of the war, 1945, when he was concerned about Greece, which is he thought if Greece fell to the communists, then so will Turkey, Syria, so on and so forth. It was brought up again in 1950 with Korea. If we don't do something about Korea, then all of Asia will fall to the communists, including the Philippines, and of course the big one, the Dutch East Indies, because that's where the oil is. You heard that probably again, Vietnam. But the real track record of the domino theory, and I bring this up when I do my Pearl Harbor talk, that what was the major reason why the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor? The Dutch East Indies, the oil. Pearl Harbor had to be hit because you didn't want the American Pacific Fleet getting involved in stopping the Japanese from bombing, from taking the Philippines. Because keep in mind, Roosevelt froze the Japanese out of American oil. That was 80% of their imports. And so the Japanese, the main target was the Dutch East Indies, because at that point in 1941, the Dutch East Indies was the world's 4th largest producer of crude. And if you can take control of the Dutch East Indies, you don't have to drill the wells. The Dutch already did that for you. All you got to do is grab them and pump. So it became Japan's gas station. But to do that, you wanted to make sure you bombed Pearl Harbor to keep the United States Navy from interfering with that. So on December 7, Pearl Harbor was an important target. It was not the main target. The main target was the Dutch East Indies. But that's part of that domino theory. That's a good question, isn't it? Who knows? But then again, and let's understand something about Mr. Trump here. If you recall, back in June, I call him the June. In fact, on my website, Mark Empire of Reason, you can go see the commentaries. And I had one called June Days. When Trump wanted to call the regular military out to clean the streets in Washington, D.C., instead of using the police or the National Guard, what did the military tell him?
Forget it.
Right, forget it. And that's after he gave them trillions of dollars for 3 years. They told him go fly a kite. Now, having said that, you have to ask the question here, if he wants to get us out of NATO, what do you think the military is going to say about that? What do you think companies like Lockheed, Boeing, and Sikorsky are going to say about General Dynamics are going to say about that? What do you think the banks are going to say about that? Well, the other side of the coin here is, Lee, he's an opponent of socialism. And so they have more socialistic aspects in Europe. And if they have to devote more money to NATO, maybe less money to some of the social programs they have. That's part of what he's doing here too. In fact, if you remember, They always wanted the Europeans to devote 2% of their gross national product to defense. If you recall, Trump raised that for the Germans to 4%. And what did Angela Merkel tell him?
Yeah,
Well,
and
he's
here-
also trying to get them to buy weapons from Lockheed, Boeing, Sikorsky, and that will keep them in the good graces with him. That's not what they're doing. Well, the guy that helped arrange that loan died last year. He was 55. He died of a heart attack. Well, if you recall what happened with the Clintons back years ago, the guy's name just slipped my mind here, who died when Clinton was involved in some shady financial dealings. What was the guy's name? Yeah, you know who I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah, he died. Now, how did he die? Well, I'm not casting dispersions here, but I mean, when the newspapers come out and say, well, he died of a heart attack at 55, that's not impossible. You know that. You know people that have died at 50 or 55 of a heart attack. But it seems awful funny that as we're building up to, the financial arrangements that the Trump administration, and he's not the first one to do this. I mean, go back to the Teapot Dome scandal of the early 1920s here. But in the shades of great power, isn't that what happens a lot of times? You get these shady financial deals here.
But
Don't believe what you hear and only half of what you read. Anyway, folks, that's about it.
All right.